Okay, we'll get started. We've got a lot to get through today. So yeah, thanks again everyone for joining this morning. So today we're here for a session on securing your enterprise with Microsoft Threat Protection and Azure Sentinel. So your hosts today are Reese Gallagher. Did you want to introduce yourself, Reese?
Yeah, thanks, Jay. Good morning, everyone. So I'm a Microsoft 365 technical specialist. So that covers, with respect to what we're going to cover today, things like Microsoft Defender Advanced Threat Protection, Microsoft Cloud App Security, and also Microsoft Endpoint Manager. That's a little about me. I've been at Microsoft for about a year and a half now. So that's all about me. Thanks, Jay.
Great, thanks, Reese. And yep, my name's Jay. So I'm Cloud Solution Architect, and I work in the Azure space. So I'll be covering more of the Azure and infrastructure side. We'll be talking about Sentinel and Security Center. I've been with Microsoft around about the same amount of time as Reese. So yeah, looking forward to diving into the security topics today. Okay. So next thing I'll mention, we do have a Q&A section in the live event today, and we have some great people there answering the questions. So if you do have any questions, feel free to pop it in, and our Microsoft peers will be able to respond to those. In terms of the agenda that we're talking about today, so we'll start with a bit of an overview. So we can't cover everything, obviously, so we're going to dive in pretty quickly straight into the technical stuff. If there's anything that you're not sure of, yeah, we've got a lot of resources that we'll share with you after the session, so you can go ahead and check those out and catch up with anything that might not have made sense at the time. So we'll start with a bit of an overview, a few slides, not very many, and then we go straight into the demos and the technical session. When we're in the tech part of the session, we'll go through the environment setup, so how you can actually configure these services from the start, so turning on Security Center, Defender ATP, and enrolling those into your devices. Then we'll do an attack simulation. So we'll start playing around with some attack tools and running some actual attacks, so as we can see what happens when you actually attack your resources and your endpoints and what that looks like in the system, and then how you can go ahead and investigate those. So what the investigation experience looks like in the Microsoft Threat Protection tools, as well as on the Azure side in Sentinel and Security Center. Then the last thing we'll go through is, once the attacks have been triggered, some actual automation. So how you respond to those events and automate some of those. Reese?
So to kick things off, let's start from the 40,000 foot view and then start progressively getting more into the detail. So to position and give you some context on where we're going to orient ourselves today, it's all about Microsoft Threat Protection all up. So let me kind of take you through the different components and how they are going to relate and communicate and coordinate with one another. Initially, from my perspective, we're going to be talking about your users and your endpoints and your cloud apps. And so when you look down the bottom left-hand corner of this slide, we're talking about user identities, monitoring those and protecting those from bad actors. Most cyber attacks begin with a compromised identity. You've probably heard in the news and in the last little while about Service New South Wales. Major government entity had a very significant security compromise, and what I'm reading in the media is that it did begin with a lack of identity protection and has led to a serious data exfiltration. In actual fact, the attack simulation we're running today somewhat aligns to that. So we're going to be looking at how we can investigate such compromises. As well as that, it obviously also will involve endpoints. So today we'll be centering on our Windows endpoints, be it Windows 10 or our Windows servers, and that's where Defender Advanced Threat Protection can help us from an endpoint protection and, more importantly, an endpoint detection and response capability. And then finally, Microsoft Cloud App Security will be monitoring our Office 365 environment for suspicious activity. In this scenario, as I mentioned, data exfiltration will be occurring. So Cloud App Security will be able to identify through user entity behavioral analytics when a certain set of behaviors is out of character or out of trend for that particular entity. In this case, it'll be a data exfiltration. Now, each of these components are individual and have their purpose, but the real value is when these attacks are occurring, they're multi-staged, and it's not useful for me to simply be presented with an alert from, say, Cloud App Security without seeing the entire attack timeline. And that is where we need to be stitching all of this together and correlating the story through Microsoft Threat Protection and, more importantly, Azure Sentinel. So all the components I've mentioned so far will feed up into Azure Sentinel, which is our cloud-native SIEM and SOAR. Not only that, Jay will then be talking to you about the infrastructure. And this is where, from a security hygiene and posture management perspective, we use Azure Security Center to monitor our infrastructure. Today, we'll be centering on virtual machines, but this also includes platform as a service related services. Azure Security Center will be able to identify when there is not only nefarious activity going on in the environment, but also give us recommendations on how to harden that environment. And again, Azure Security Center will be feeding its alerts into Azure Sentinel. And as we get to the investigation phase, we will see the real value of how Azure Sentinel can show us that a much larger multi-stage attack is occurring in our environment that started with our users, but in actual fact spread to our infrastructure. Thanks, Jay.
Next slide. So, excuse me. So this is our lab environment that we've put together for the session today, just to give you a bit of a visualization so you can see what we're kind of going through. So we've got our nefarious bad actor on the left here coming in from the internet. So this is the attacker or the bad actor that's going to be performing the attacks. Unfortunately, we've got some management ports open to the internet, so they've been able to come in and attack these servers on 3389. So they've taken control of this machine here, attacker PC. And then from this attacker PC, the attacker will be launching some attacks onto a server client, which is a server 2019, and this, which is a desktop client victim. Now, the victim PC is hooked into your modern workplace world of Office 365 and Microsoft Threat Protection. So we're protected with Defender Advanced Threat Protection, or Defender ATP. We're looking at Cloud App Security, so Microsoft Cloud App Security, and Azure Active Directory from identity standpoints. Now, inside our Azure VNet that we have here, we're also using some of the PaaS services. So the platform as a service, we have SQL, some storage, and the server, and these are all integrated into Security Center. So all the logs and telemetry from these devices is being sent into Security Center, which will do some security hygiene and posture management. And then the logs from all of these are being brought together into Azure Sentinel. So as Reese was saying, to give us the full picture across our infrastructure and our modern work and endpoints and devices and everything that we have in our environment, we're feeding all those logs and telemetry and alerts over into Sentinel for further analysis and investigation. Okay, now we'll have a look at the attacks that we're running. Go ahead, Reese.
Thanks, Jay. So to give you the scenario today that we're going to run you through, we'll give you this a quick overview from it and a really nice visual. So as I mentioned, quite often most cyber attacks begin with a compromised identity, whether this is through some form of phishing, or in our case, we're actually going to simulate a brute force password attack. So we will obtain the credentials of a standard user in a particular fictitious company named Contoso, and just so happens that Contoso doesn't have great security hygiene and have yet to roll out and enable multi-factor authentication. So once we pop that account, we can then start to begin our attack. And what we'll first do, as the attacker on their own machine, they're going to fire up the Tor browser, which is a very popular way of anonymizing one's identity and browsing traffic. And we're going to use that Tor browser session to sign into the Office 365 tenant and go into that compromised user's OneDrive and steal some data. Once we've exfiltrated that data, we'll then turn our attention to looking at the user's endpoint, infecting it with malware, gaining a foothold, and then attempting to steal some further credentials and perform lateral movement to move towards a privileged server where we're going to perform some, implant some more malware, and then also modify some sensitive files, which could be either maybe system files, could equally be a database containing customer data. And so we will step you through some of these in a live demo. Some of these have been pre-staged for time, in the interest of time. So we'll have a look at firstly how we set up the environment to detect this sort of attack, and then we'll run through some of the simulation of these steps, and then really where the meat on the bone here, as it were, is then investigating this. And so we'll then be investigating and attempting to uncover each stage of this attack through Microsoft Threat Protection and Azure Sentinel. Thanks, Jake.
Good news. That's the end of the slides. So if you want to go ahead and take over the presentation, we can get started with the onboarding.
Yep, let's go. Okay, so here I am on my machine at the moment. I'm signed in as the global administrator of the Contoso M365 and Azure tenant. Initially, so from my point of view, I'm the Office 365 administrator. So I'm concerned with my end users and their devices, being their Windows 10 endpoints. And I'm also concerned, obviously, with the data that's contained within my Office 365 tenant with things like OneDrive and SharePoint. And so therefore, I want to enable tools like, as I said, Defender ATP and Microsoft Cloud App Security to monitor and protect those. As a security admin on the Microsoft 365 side of things, all roads begin with the security portal, which is at security.microsoft.com. I'm well aware that there are a few different portals, such as the legacy Office 365 security and compliance portal. I can reassure you that we are shifting to these new portals that are role specific. This is more pertinent to larger organizations where the security team is very separate and distinct from those that are concerned with compliance tasks. So we're now going to have separate portals to cater for those. Similarly, if you think about Endpoint Manager, which we'll look at later on, that's a portal specifically for somebody who is an end user compute administrator, a device administrator. So I just wanted to quickly orient you on where we're beginning here, which is in that security portal, and a quick plug to go and have a look at your secure score. That is a very, very useful resource to tell you, how do you rank overall and where can you improve? What controls could you enable in the platform to increase your security posture? Now, it's worthwhile noting the goal here is not to get to 100%, but it's, I think, to have this trend line be trending upwards. So this is actually mapping your secure score over time. And as you can see in my environment in Contoso, things are going in the wrong direction. So ideally, we want to be building up our secure score over time, and we never want it to go down, or in other words, regress. We don't want to ever be disabling a particular security control once we've implemented it. So with that said and done, we do have to, from an onboarding perspective, go into each of the individual security tools. So the first one is Microsoft Defender ATP, which is at securitycenter.microsoft.com. Now, don't fret. We don't have to go to all these different portals day to day. This is only for really the initial onboarding and more in-depth investigation. From day to day, we'll only have to live in that security portal to perform our investigations, which we'll look at later. So once you've purchased some Microsoft 365 licenses that include Defender ATP, this is usually something like what we call M365 E5, but there are other ways of getting Defender ATP. Once those licenses have landed in your admin portal, you'll then be able to visit the Defender ATP Security Center. And whilst I've already set up my Defender ATP tenant, I'm showing you the screen that you'll see when you first open this security center. And it's going to ask you, where do you want to store your data? At present, you can see it's a little bit faint, but you can see that we've got the ability to store our Defender ATP data in the United States, the UK, or Europe. At present, we don't support, we don't have a Defender ATP in Australian data centers, so that would need to be a consideration when deploying Defender ATP. Now, it's worthwhile noting this is separate and distinct from your Exchange and your SharePoint. That typically for this market, for Australian customers, your Exchange, your SharePoint will be sitting in Australia. So when you talk about customer data that might be sitting in email or in documents stored in OneDrive, that is always going to be in Australia. This is purely about the telemetry that we're collecting from an EDR standpoint being stored in a particular data center. You'll also want to decide how long you want to retain that EDR telemetry with a maximum of 180 days. At present, there's no way to extend that. It is worthwhile mentioning that we do have the ability to output some of this data, especially the alerts, to a SIEM. Obviously, today we're going to be forwarding those incidents to Azure Sentinel. So once you've decided on those options initially, and actually it's worthwhile, I should say, once you choose the data storage location, it can never be changed. You'll notice here it's grayed out. We can modify the retention period, but we can never change that data storage location. So do choose that wisely. You'll then want to have a look at the advanced features, which is found under settings. I've just hidden the side menu here, but under settings and then advanced features. You'll want to review each of these carefully. There's a few features in here that are in preview, so they aren't necessarily ready for prime time in production. So you do want to be mindful of that. One of those is enabling EDR in block mode. So this is in public preview, so you can go and test it out. I have it turned on in my environment. This is especially pertinent if you're using Defender ATP with a third-party antivirus product. So you're not necessarily using Defender antivirus. Defender ATP does play nice with any antivirus product. And where this is really useful is that you might be using something like Symantec or McAfee, for instance. And maybe that endpoint protection product missed a particular threat, but Defender ATP detected it. So now what Defender ATP can do is it can stop particular processes from occurring. So this gives you a second layer of defense from a response perspective, despite not having Defender antivirus in the environment. So encourage you to test that, and then as it moves to general availability, enable that in production. A couple of other call-outs in here. You'll want to turn on your Azure ATP integration if you're using that. Not something we're covering off today, but very useful to correlate the signals that Azure ATP is bringing in. Also, you'll want to enable threat intelligence from Office 365. So this gives you enriched intelligence with respect to things like malicious attachments coming in via email. We definitely want to enable the Microsoft Cloud App Security integration so that these two products can be sharing signals with one another. Probably Azure Information Protection, you want that enabled as well. Definitely want the Secure Score enabled. So I mentioned that earlier. Secure Score can then give you a consolidated list of recommendations to deploy in your environment. Web content filtering is a brand new feature that allows you to, as it says on the label, you can now block certain types of web content, things that are inappropriate for work. So that can displace existing products that you might have in the environment. We definitely want to enable Intune, and I will cover that in a moment, but we definitely want to turn that on. And then, as I mentioned here, there's preview features. So you may want these on, you may want these off. If you have a separate instance of Defender ATP for maybe for testing or UAT purposes, maybe you want to enable the preview features there. The next one is the automatic remediation. So Defender ATP's one of its biggest value pieces of value that it'll bring to your organization is the ability to automatically respond to a threat once it's been detected. By default, we will have our remediation level is semi-automatic, which means, and we'll see this in the investigation experience, Defender ATP will make a determination on what actions it wants to take, in particular, maybe what processes it wants to stop or what files it wants to quarantine, and it will present those to the security operations analyst to approve that action before it occurs. This is very useful when you're evaluating the product early on, and over time, as you become more confident in what the product is wanting to do, you might want to turn this on to automatic. And so automatic will then mean that as soon as we detect something, we will take actions immediately. Now, you need to assign those remediation levels to devices. So as I said, by default, any device that's not been designated will have semi-automatic enabled by default. But then over time, you might want to start moving machines over to the automatic designation. So I've got a machine group here, and I then choose the automation level. And then I need to set up a rule that will then generate a list of machines. So this is based upon a few different values. You can use machine names that start with, end with, equals, or contains. The domain, it could also be machine tagging that comes from Intune, or you could simply do it via operating system. And then you can then run a preview to show you the number of machines that have been scooped up by that machine group. I'll just discard that. Once you've got that set up, then you're ready to onboard some machines for testing. Now, initially, so we come down here to onboarding, and then you choose which operating systems you want to onboard. So in this case, I'm going to talk about Windows 10 initially. So for initial testing and evaluation, you can come down here and actually grab a script that you can run locally on the machine. That's only useful in the early phase, obviously. Then at scale, we've got a few different options here. We can deploy via group policy. And again, when you choose that option, it'll give you a small package to download and some instructions on how to then deploy that via group policy. I'm not going to cover that here today. The new version of SCCM, which is now known as Microsoft Endpoint Manager Configuration Manager, can also be used to do this, and there's native integration within its UI to integrate with Defender ATP. Once again, there's a small package that you need to grab to kick that off. There's also a package here for earlier versions of SCCM. We do also have specific onboarding scripts for VDI. There is some very specific considerations for VDI, which are covered off in the article linked. But I'm going to talk specifically about Intune. So Intune is probably the most flexible way and the easiest way to get up and running, especially if you have machines already enrolled into Intune. So, and in actual fact, a lot of this is done by toggling that setting earlier in the advanced features for the Intune integration piece I showed you. The other half of that equation needs to be done in the Endpoint Manager console, which, and here's another short link for you, endpoint.microsoft.com. So when you come to the Endpoint Manager console, there's an endpoint security blade. And then within there is a blade for setting up Defender ATP. Now you can see that I've already enabled my connection here, but all we need to do to onboard new Windows machines is to go and toggle this setting to on. We're also beginning to offer Android, and in the future we will be offering iOS from a mobile threat defense point of view. Once you toggle this setting to on, Any machines that are any Windows 10 machines enrolled in Intune already will silently be enabled for Defender ATP. And any new machines you onboard or enroll into Intune will also be onboarded to Defender ATP. You don't need to necessarily configure any specific configuration profiles. By turning this on, Intune does the heavy lifting for you. With that, that's how you onboard to Defender ATP. And so I'm now going to hand back to Jay to talk about onboarding to Azure Security Center and starting Azure Sentinel.
Fantastic. Just going to start sharing my screen.
Go for it.
Great. Thank you. Okay. So moving over to the infrastructure and the Azure side. So we're going to have a look at onboarding Security Center and Sentinel, how we can enable those and get them up and running. So we're starting here just in the Azure portal, portal.azure.com, and we're going to start with Security Center. Top tip, use the search bar for everything. Search for Security Center, go ahead and go into it. So Security Center is already enabled in this environment, but I'll show you how it gets enabled and turned on. So Security Center itself is enabled at the subscription level. So you can scope it on your subscription and enable either the basic or the standard version. So if we go over to pricing and settings on the left here, so we can see our subscription that's here and our log analytics workspace. We talk a bit about those later. Go to our subscription. And this is where you enable subscription Security Center on your subscription. So there's two tiers for the pricing. There's a free tier, which is enabled by default when you have an Azure subscription. As part of the free tier, you'll get the assessment and security recommendations. So this is around your security hygiene and baselining your security posture, and a secure score. So similarly to what Reese showed you in the Microsoft Threat Protection, you have an Azure Secure Score as well, which is going to give you an opportunity to baseline your security. Now, if we switch over to the standard version, which is what we're going through today, then you get the more advanced features included in that. So then we add things like just-in-time VM access, adaptive app and networking hardening, compliance dashboards. You get Defender ATP for servers, so that's your server endpoint detection and response, and threat protection for supported PaaS services. Now, one thing that's not mentioned here is vulnerability management. So as part of the standard version of Security Center now, there's also built-in vulnerability assessments using Qualys Cloud Agents. So we'll have a bit of a look at what that looks like, but that's another feature as part of the standard one. So once you've gone ahead and enabled that on the subscription level, then you can go and turn it on or off on the different resource types. So if we just want to enable it for virtual machines and not these other services, you can just enable it for those. And then these will get onboarded into Security Center Standard. Now, if we just go down to data collection. So once you've actually enabled it, whether you're going for the free or the standard version, you go to data collection. So you can configure in here the auto provisioning. So this is going to go ahead and automatically provision the agent onto your virtual machines that are in Azure. So if you click auto provisioning on, when you create a virtual machine in Azure, the MMA agent or the Microsoft monitoring agent or extension as it's called will get installed into that virtual machine automatically, and it will get enabled and configured to talk to the workspace. So the workspace is a log analytics workspace. Security Center, Sentinel, Azure Monitor, a lot of these solutions in Azure are underpinned by log analytics, which is just a storage platform. So it's a storage platform which is optimized for running queries and analytics against. And effectively, all of the logs, telemetry, events, alerts that are ingested from the different sources are then stored inside log analytics. And on top of that workspace, the log analytics workspace, you have your solutions like Security Center, Sentinel, and so on. So in this case, where we're defining the workspace, you can just create a default one where it will just give you a random GUID and create a workspace for you, or you just choose the workspace and then we're just choosing the workspace and it will bring those logs into there. You can also configure here which level of event login that comes across. So if you're just going to bring a small set of your security events, or if you want to bring them all along with AppLocker, you can configure that there to sort of tune the events that are coming through. Okay, if we go back, so we've got we've enabled it at the subscription level, and we've got the auto provisioning on. So when we deploy a virtual machine, it's going to go ahead and automatically install that extension for us. If we go to our virtual machines, I'll just show on a different tab here. So this is the list of virtual machines we have. We can have a look at an onboarding virtual machine, have a look at the extensions, and you'll see that when this VM gets created, the Microsoft monitoring agent is installed there. So you should see that one getting deployed when you create a virtual machine. Okay, back over here in Security Center, we'll go back to the overview page. So this is the front page of Security Center. And then we'll have a look at this inventory. So this is a fairly new addition to Security Center. If we go to inventory, we can see a list of all the different resources and a status of whether they're being monitored by Security Center or not. So we can see these virtual machines are monitored. So they have an agent installed on them, they're being monitored, and the pricing tier for those is standard. Now, some of these, you might be able to diagnose issues if you have virtual machines that aren't communicating or don't have the agent installed. And you can also have a look and see, okay, some of these resources may not be talking to the log analytics workspace. So that's why these ones aren't covered here. So the logs have to be coming into the log analytics workspace for Security Center to be able to do the analysis on top of those. Now, what about non-Azure virtual machines? So Security Center is a hybrid infrastructure management tool, so it supports Azure virtual machines as well as non-Azure virtual machines. So from here, we can have a look at the top here. There's an Add Non-Azure Servers button. Click that one. It's going to, again, let you choose the log analytic workspace where you want to send the logs to. So we're just using the same one here, Synergy SOC. If we go Add Servers, it's going to give you a link to download the agent manually. So then you can either install it manually or use your deployment tools to go and install that agent onto your on-prem servers and then send it across to this workspace with these keys, which I will definitely regenerate later. Okay, so we've got our Azure virtual machines automatically onboarded. We can go ahead and install the agent onto the non-Azure virtual machines as well. And then that'll bring us to the to this kind of view. So we're using the standard version. We get these three categories here. So we have the top category, similar to what Reese was saying, we've got a secure score. So this is a measurement of a relative score of what you can achieve in your environment based on the security controls you've got configured. And you want to be uptrending that. So a great way to use this is to baseline your security and then maybe report back to the business or back to management and say, hey, we've got an extremely poor one here of 25%, and we want to make a market improvement. Say we want to spend, some time and resources to improve that by 30%. So you can actually measure the improvement that you're giving back to the business based on the investment in security. Also, you've got the regulatory compliance. So this is more focused around different frameworks, like it could be PCI, ISO 27001, NIST, all of these sort of frameworks are built in there. And when you go and view that, it will evaluate the controls against what you have in your environment, whether you're passing or failing against those controls. Next one down here, security hygiene. So these are the recommendations in the configuration management which actually make up that secure score. So from here, you'll be able to see all the different bits and pieces which are recommended to improve in your environment. For example, closing those management ports to the internet. Now, I mentioned before that you can do vulnerability management as part of Security Center. So we've onboarded the monitoring agents, but if we want to enable vulnerability management as well, we can do that from here. So we go down to compute and app resources and just drill into those. We have a look here, we get a bunch of these configuration recommendations. So these are all the issues in the environment that need addressing. And let's just filter down on vulnerability. And we get these three. So typically you'll see 3 or 4 of these once you enable Security Center. The first one here, a vulnerability assessment should be enabled on your virtual machines. So this is just saying that you need to actually roll that agent out. So you can go ahead, click into that. It's going to tell you which virtual machines need the agent installed. You can go ahead and choose which ones are relevant to you, click remediate, and then it'll take it through and install the Qualys Cloud Agent onto those virtual machines so as it starts running the vulnerability assessment. So we've got this already enabled. You can see if we go to healthier resources, we've got this already enabled on one of our virtual machines. So if we head back a step, so once you've actually rolled that agent out, then you're going to get these recommendations here saying that the actual vulnerabilities in your VMs should be remediated. And just to quickly show you what that looks like, so it's all within the same dashboard. Once the Qualys agent runs its vulnerability assessment, it will give you back these recommendations. So these are apps which are installed into our virtual machine. For example, Firefox, which has an old version installed. It will show you the CVEs, the threat, the details about the actual threat, and then how to remediate it and which patches to apply. So that's all built into the security portal, and this is powered by the Qualys Cloud Agent for the vulnerability management component. Now, last thing, so we head back to the overview page here. So we've also got some PAS resources we had in our lab environment. So just to quickly show you what that would look like, if we go across here to SQL. So this is an Azure SQL PAS database. So this is the database server that's running inside Azure. And from here, we can go to advanced data security, and then you can turn it on and off. So if we enable advanced data security and then send it to the relevant storage account, it's going to start sending those logs from your SQL database and start showing those recommendations inside Security Center. Now, the other one you can configure here is the vulnerability assessment for the actual SQL database. So this is similarly to the virtual machine one, but it's going to run vulnerability assessments against the database. So you can run periodic scans and then go ahead and configure the email address that that gets sent to. So once you enable that on your database servers, if you drill down into the database itself, you'll be able to see that 3 components. So we've just got one database here. Go to advanced data security, and then you can see the results based on your databases. So in here, you can see data classification recommendations. So it's going to look at your columns and say there's sensitive or PII or PHI or whatever it is within your database. And then it will recommend some sensitivity labels be assigned to those. You've also got vulnerability assessment. So again, it will run this periodically and give you the results. And then you've got the advanced threat protection, which is the more reactive side, saying that there's actually been some SQL injection attacks or some attacks have been detected in the environment. Okay, so that's Security Center. And then just a quick onboarding of Sentinel. I'll show you what this looks like to get it set up. So Sentinel, effectively, if we go back to the home screen, so we want to set up Sentinel. Again, it sits on top of an Azure Log Analytics workspace. So if we go for a search, find Azure Sentinel, then the first thing that comes up when you open this is Azure Sentinel workspaces. So it's saying, what workspace do you want to enable the Sentinel solution on top of? So we're using the same one. You can go ahead and add a new one, and then just add Azure Sentinel to either an existing or new Log Analytics workspace. In this case, we're just going to continue with our existing one. And then we get this overview screen. So initially, when you set it up, you're not going to have any data in here. You're just going to have a blank overview screen. And the first thing that you want to do with Sentinel is go ahead and enable those data connectors. So with the data connectors, there's a few different types. Essentially, you have 3 different types of them. You have APIs, which are your cloud connectors typically. So services like Azure ATP, Active Directory, Security Center, Office 365, all of these type of cloud connectors are pre-wired APIs. So if we take Office 365 as an example, we can click on this, go open connector page, and these are just click next, and it will start bringing the data across. So you'll need some tenant permissions on your Office 365 tenant, and assuming you've got that, then you can go ahead and bring Exchange, SharePoint, and the new one, which is recently added, Teams, if you want to. So you can start bringing those logs across. Hit apply changes, and then you'll see this graph here. It'll start bringing across and pulling those log data. Now, what you want to do once you've set up those data connectors is go over to next steps. So this is a handy way to start getting some intel from those data connectors that you've connected. It's going to show you the relevant workbooks. So workbooks are kind of like a dashboard, kind of like an active dashboard that you can play around with and configure. I'll show you some of these a bit later. You can query the raw logs. So if you're looking for sample queries to run to get a visibility on what logs are coming across, you can just go ahead, click run, it will bring you to the log analytics experience. So this is actually log analytics itself. These are the tables and everything which are stored inside the log analytics databases. And this is the query that we're running. So it's pre-populated that and it's running the query so we can get details on all the data directly. Going back to the Office 365 connector. So the other thing you want to do once you've got your connector enabled is you actually want to enable some analytics rules. So these are your alerts that are going to be configured on top of your data connector. So if we're pulling data from Office 365, then all of these alerts become relevant to us. So we want to go and enable most of these or any of that you feel are relevant in your environment. So if we say, as an example, malicious inbox rule, create rule. So this will take you then, walk you through the wizard to create the rule. So essentially you want to go ahead, enable the rule. There's some rule logic in here. So you don't have to worry about this query. It automatically builds the query for you. It populates it with entities. So these would be your IPs in the incident, your hosts and accounts, as long as they're relevant to the query. So depending the type of query you're running, these entities may look different. And then the scheduling. So it's going to run, this particular query is going to run once a day, and it's going to look at 1 day's worth of data. That's what this is saying here. So you can make these a lot more granular. If you need this to run more frequently, you can run it every 5 minutes. And then it will go ahead and run that query every 5 minutes, depending on what type of alert that you're running. It will, it may vary on the frequency that you want to actually run it on. There's also some configuration items down here in order to suppress. So if you're running the alert and it's the kind of alert that's going to pop over and over and over again, then you may want to go and put some suppression on that so as it doesn't just create noise inside the system. Similarly, you can group the events together to into a single alert. So if it's creating multiple alerts for the same event, then you can group them together. Okay, moving on to incident settings. So there's some more settings here around grouping the alerts together. One that I want to show you is the automated response. So when you're creating the alert rule, this is where you have the option to assign a logic app or a playbook, as they're called in the Sentinel world. So I'll show you a bit more about these afterwards, but effectively you can assign a automated response to one of these alerts. So we can say when this alert fires, please go ahead and run this playbook, which is a logic app on the back end. And then it will go ahead and run through that logical workflow, which we'll go through in much more detail a bit later. And that's it, review and create, and then we can go and create that rule. I haven't set it all up, so we'll just cancel out of that one. So if we go back, so that's for this data connector. So this is the typical workflow for any of the data connectors that you bring across through the APIs. If we go back a step and have a look, I mentioned there's a couple of different types of connectors. So just quickly to give you an idea, if you have a look at if you want to bring in your firewalls or some of your network appliances, so if we say Fortinet, these are going to come in via syslog. So if you click on the particular data connector, it will give you the instructions and even it'll give you the commands that you need to run. So you can go ahead and set that up. And effectively what you're doing is you're outputting those logs via syslog to a Linux server or a Linux syslog collector. And then there'll be an agent installed on that same collector, which will encrypt and send the logs up to log analytics. So it's the same process as before. You can then go in and look at the next steps and have a look at the different queries and rules which you can assign once you've got the data coming in. And that's about it. So once you've done that, you've got your data streaming into Sentinel and you've got Security Center set up. So we've also got that configured in our environment. So for the purpose of the demo, we've got Security Center already configured and connected up, as well as our Cloud App Security, Defender ATP, and all of the different services that we're talking about today. And that's about that wrapped up. So over to you, Reese.
All right, thanks, Jay. Let me share my screen. All right, so now we've done all the onboarding. Now the environment is ready, and it is ready to be attacked. So we talked earlier about the hypothetical attack, and it begins with identity. Now, none of the attacks that we're running today use any malicious underground black hat tools. Initially, how we're going to pop the identity, we're going to kind of bend the truth a little bit here. You would imagine that the bad guys have their own tools to perform either brute force or they're going to send phishing emails, they're going to do password sprays. They've got tools to do that. Now, funnily enough, within Office 365 ATP, which is the email security solution within Microsoft Threat Protection, we've actually got a couple of attack simulators that you as customers can run to prepare yourselves ahead of potentially falling victim to a real attack. And you can test your preparedness and understand what might be the blast radius if such an attack were to occur. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm playing the role of a bad guy, but in actual fact, I'm going to use the Office Attack Simulator to pop this credential for me. Now, it's worthwhile mentioning, we do protect the privacy of our customers. So when you run these sort of attacks, especially something like the dictionary attack and the password spray, we don't give you back the popped passwords, but we do tell you which users had a password that we were able to crack. So this is very useful. If you've got some password tables of commonly used passwords, which I do, it's not hard to go and find them on the internet. And you can put those in here and target your internal users and then get an understanding of who are using weak passwords. Equally, and probably more importantly, as part of a cybersecurity awareness campaign, we can send simulated phishing emails to staff to understand, what is the likelihood that they may fall victim to a real phishing attempt. And then as this product builds out, it will become more sophisticated. We'll start to build in some e-learning components here so that if somebody does fail a phishing sim, they can then receive some just-in-time education so they might know better for next time. So to get to this portal, this is in that previous legacy Office 365 security and compliance portal I mentioned, which over time we will begin to retire. But for the time being, the attack simulator does live in here. So here's another URL for you, protection.office.com. And then the attack simulator can be found under threat management on the left-hand side, and then attack simulator. And as I say, for the purposes of today, we're going to run a simple brute force against our users. And what we're going to find is that one of our users is using a very weak password. And also, as I mentioned, Contoso as a company has yet to roll out MFA. So once I pop this password, we're going to be able to take control of this account. So how would you run one of these yourself? You can go hit launch attack and you get taken through a bit of a wizard experience. So we can give it a name to the campaign. And then you can choose to target your users. Now you can upload a file or you can go look at the address book. Also be mindful that you can only attack up to 10,000 accounts at a time. If your organization has less than 10,000 users, then you can kind of cheat this and come into address book, go to filter, and then just hit apply with no filters. As you would expect, what that brings back is all my user accounts that exist in my tenant. Then it'll ask me, what passwords do you want to use in the attack? Now, you could sit here and type them out manually, which is incredibly laborious. So as I say, I went to the internet and found a list of commonly used passwords, bearing in mind that the password file can have no more than 30,000 of these. And I can go and upload this text file. And then next, and hit finish. This does take a little while to run, as you can imagine. Brute forcing all of these accounts with all of those passwords can take some time. But you can, once you finish this wizard, you can then come in and check back on the progress of the attack. Now, in the interest of expediency, I've run one earlier. So I've got my webinar demo and I can view the report. And we'll find that Alex, he's a very, very bad, naughty user, and his password is password1 with a capital P. Now, as I say, you don't see that password in here. We are protecting their privacy, but you as IT now know that you probably need to have a discussion with this individual or send them an email about better password, stronger password hygiene. But In place of this, as a bad guy, I've brute forced this password and now I know what it is, and I can now go about my attack. So on the attacker's machine, my first step here is I want to steal some data before I really make myself known to this organization by infecting them with malware. Now I'm making a small assumption here that maybe I've also then gone and phished this user Alex and infected some malware on his machine. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. But now I've got his password. I want to go steal some data first to maybe potentially ransom that later. What we are now starting to see with some of these high-profile ransomware attacks is that prior to the ransomware executing and encrypting all the files, the bad guys will actually go in silently and steal and exfiltrate a whole heap of documents first that might contain something like customer data and PII, and hold that, then execute the ransomware and issue the ransom request. Then the victim needs to decide how they're going to respond. And now, if the victim were to say, we're not going to pay the ransom, we're going to restore from backup. We have a good backup regime, we can recover that way. We're not going to pay the bad guys. And in actual fact, in certain jurisdictions, it is illegal to pay certain organized crime groups. So you're actually somewhat prevented from doing so. So therefore, what the bad guys then do is they're 1-2 punch. Okay, we hit you with ransomware and you're saying you can recover from it. Well, we've stolen your customer data and we're holding it ransom. If you don't pay the ransom, we will leak the data. And so now all of a sudden, we've now got a very impossible situation to deal with. So we need to be able to, ideally prevent that, or if not that, then detect when that occurs, because quite often these sort of compromises happen months or weeks before it's ever detected. So I'm on my own machine, I've stolen the credentials and I've logged into Alex's OneDrive in the Tor browser. So I'm trying to hide and anonymize my connection and my identity. I don't want this exfiltration attempt traced back to me. So I've gone into Office 365 and done that. And now I'm going to go into his OneDrive and just go and siphon out a whole heap of documents all at once. And I could be, going to, different SharePoint sites, Teams and what have you, and stealing a whole heap of different data. Now, I've run that and I've now siphoned that data out. And then the next thing that I'm then going to do is, obviously, as I say, and I'm not going to show you this piece, but I'll talk to it, is that I now want to go in and infiltrate the network. We're now going to pivot on-prem. So maybe I've infected that, I've phished this user, and they've been fooled into downloading some malware, and now I'm establishing a foothold on that machine. And then looking to move laterally through the network, try and gain access to that server I mentioned earlier, steal credentials, so on and so forth. As I say, I'm not using any black hat tools to do this. Interestingly enough, you as a customer, though, can run some simulations of these advanced persistent threats using Defender ATP. So once you buy Defender ATP, or even prior to doing that, if you get a trial of Defender ATP, which we'll talk about later, during the trial phase or your evaluation phase, there's actually a whole section about evaluations. And so what you can do when you come in here, you can set up a lab, not too dissimilar to what we're showing you today. By hitting set up lab, we give you a few virtual machines spun up in Azure automatically, and they are connected to your Defender ATP tenant. So they are completely isolated from your environment. So that way you can go in there and wreak any sort of havoc you want to test out and stress the product. And what we've actually done through some of our partners is give you a simulations catalog. So there's a few here, and the one that the couple that we're talking about today is APT 29 and credential theft. So these, some of our partners, Attack IQ and SafeBreach, have packaged up the attacks and techniques of some known black hat groups and package them up in such a way that you can run these as simulations against those throwaway virtual machines. You don't keep them forever, they only hang around for a small period of time. So you can run these simulated attacks and then see the alerts come back, and you can begin to investigate those and become more familiar with the product. So, as I mentioned, I've run these already against a couple of machines, the Windows 10 client that belongs to Alex, as well as a server that Jay will talk about a bit later. So we will run those, and then when we get to the investigation, we will see all the different alerts that have come back, and more importantly, all of those being correlated together as part of a single targeted attack by a particular threat actor. So that's all about the attack simulation and setting it up from the end user side. So now Jay is going to talk about then carrying on into the infrastructure, what other parts of this attack are occurring. Take it away, Jay.
Righto. So just switching the sharing again.
Yep.
So here we're on server victim. If you think back to the diagram that I showed you earlier, so this is server victim, and we're just going to sort of complete some of those attacks. So Reese has done a lot of the work, or the attacker has just gone basically berserk inside the environment, gone into the attacker PC and run all their attacks against the victim. And this is the victim server. So they've moved laterally in the environment, they've taken control of this session or something like that, and they're starting to do some other attacks. And really just what I want to demonstrate here is some of the things that we're going to see in the Azure and the infrastructure tools. So one of them is we've got our storage services enabled for ATP. So they're hooked into Security Center, which we had a look before. And we can actually, this is a very common test tool, so you can look online, some of these test tools for actually testing the alerting with inside, whether it's Security Center or even on antiviruses. For example, if I take this test file and move it into this folder, then Defender is going to come up and detect that. So I've actually excluded that from Defender. So if you try this out and use these test tools, then you're going to find that it's actually going to delete that file straight away. So what I can do then is I want to upload that file into my Azure Storage account. So I've got Azure Storage Explorer here just to connect to it. Hit on upload files. Just going to choose my test file here and upload that into the storage. So that's going up into blob storage, where I've got just a few test files here. That's going to get uploaded, and then we should see some of that inside Azure Security Center when we look at that. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you is they're just going to start running some processes. So this has already been compromised, this machine. As we said, we're going to chuck it out later, delete this one, but we're going to actually just run a test process. So again, this is something you can find online in terms of testing your Security Center capabilities and alerts. We've just got a test script that's already built here. I'm going to go ahead and run it. And then that's going to get run against the environment. So that's going to try and create some rogue process effectively inside the server, and we should see some details about that when we're going to analyze it. Now, being the diligent attacker that I am, I've gone and run all my attacks, and I'm actually just going to go ahead and clear all those event logs. So I know that probably the system administrators here is capturing these event logs. I don't want that. I don't want any traces of what I've been doing here. So I'm going to go ahead and clear that event log to hide my steps, and then we'll go from there. So that's pretty much it. So the attack has been through the environment. We've simulated some of the attacks from Defender ATP and from the Microsoft Threat Protection. And then we've just done some very sort of low-level demonstration attacks here, where we've got a server which is running some rogue processes and has some dodgy files running on it as well. So that's it for that part. So now we're going to start having a look at the investigation process. So we're going to flick back and start having a look at the investigation from the Microsoft Threat Protection lens, and then we'll dive into Security Center and Sentinel.
All right, thanks, Jay. So now we've done all the damage, the fun piece is over, now the hard work begins. So I've now come back to the Microsoft Security Portal, and I've gone to incidents. So as I said, this is now your day-to-day. As a security operations analyst, if I have Sentinel in play, then absolutely Sentinel is where I should be going, and we'll see that a bit later. But also, all these different Microsoft security components are modular. You can buy just one of them and gain value from that particular component. And a good example is that of that is something like Defender ATP and Microsoft Cloud App Security. Customers it's very hard to deploy all of these components all at once as part of one large project. A lot of customers tend to break it down into smaller pieces and will roll it out over time as resources allow. So therefore, today, you might only have Defender ATP in place, and so therefore the best way to investigate an incident coming out of that is from this portal. And then in the future, as you potentially plug in and layer over the top Azure Sentinel, then we start pivoting and moving shifting our focus to Azure Sentinel. But if we did just have Defender ATP and Cloud App Security, we would begin our investigation here. You'll see that if you take note of the timestamps, we've got a couple of incidents here that have occurred very recently, and paying close attention to the number of alerts that were correlated into a single incident. So you think about traditional security operations, everything was very much alert and event driven, and it meant that you were looking at an absolute wall of alerts, and it was very hard to discern what was important and what was simply noise, and more importantly, what alerts were related to one another. So Microsoft Threat Protection on its own has some fairly advanced correlation capability and response capability. Now you might say that sounds a little bit like what a SIEM does, and that's true. But however, it's only for the Microsoft Threat Protection products, being Defender ATP, Cloud App Security, Office ATP, and Azure ATP. So you'll also notice the different detection sources here, and we'll come back a little bit later and pay attention to this Tor IP address event that was detected by Cloud App Security. But firstly, let's have a look at this one that was detected by EDR and antivirus, and we go into the overview summary. This is very quick overview for a security operations analyst to understand the severity and the scope of what this incident entails. I can see the different entities, users and machines. You'll also notice that this machine actually has an investigation or risk level priority assigned to it. So when you first set up MTP, you can assign risk values to users and devices. So an example of this would be your C-suite, your most senior leadership. You probably want to assign them a high priority. They are very likely to be targeted for phishing attacks, and their machines could be containing very confidential data, as an example. And so what happens is if they become involved in an incident, you get this view telling you that there are some high value assets involved in the incident, and therefore you might want to focus your investigation on them. Over on the left hand side, you'll see a nice visual attack timeline of all the different alerts, and this visual graph mapping individual alerts to the MITRE attack framework. So you'll see here that there's been some malware execution, there's been some credential theft, discovery, so we've been enumerating the network, trying to perform lateral movement, and some collection of data. So then if I go look at the alerts view, now again, this is a bit of a wall of text. The important thing here is that all of these alerts have already been correlated. So everything we're seeing here is useful and high value to me in my investigation and my response, and it's already been sorted chronologically. And you'll see the different detection sources as well as the categories as we roll down the page. Things in here like particular malware was prevented, which is great. And you'll actually see here, some of these statuses have already been marked as resolved. And the demo gods have just failed me, but that's all right. We'll roll along. You saw there that there was either malware that was detected and prevented or blocked. Well, that is as a result of the automatic investigation and remediation capability. So as I mentioned, there was a credential theft in this scenario. And so Mimikat's a pretty popular tool for that. We've detected it and then be able to stop it in its tracks almost immediately. So you'll see these automatic investigations come in two parts. There's the investigation piece. So once we detect an alert has triggered, we then kick off an investigation of the machine. This is driven by a series of playbooks that we've written to go and analyze a machine forensically, which otherwise might have taken a human investigator many hours to complete. So you'll see all the different number of different entities that have already been analyzed, and then in actual fact what you see here is that some of those have been remediated. Now this machine was set up for automatic remediation. So remember, during the onboarding phase, I said that they're by default, you've got semi-automatic. If you had a semi-automatic machine in this investigation, you have a message here saying it's waiting for you to respond and approve the action. But this machine, on the other hand, is set up for automatic remediation. So we'll see that in very quick succession, this threat was shut down. So, and in actual fact, what we see here is this occurred overnight. From a people and process point of view, paging someone and getting them to wake up, log on and investigate something takes time. Whereas what MTP, and to be fair, also Azure Sentinel with its SOAR capability is capable of doing, allows us to automatically respond and remediate these issues occurring. And in a lot of these cases, such things where minutes truly matter in being able to stop an attack from getting to the point of really crippling a business. Now, I mentioned there was also that we had a look at the initial data exfiltration. So we did also detect that. And within here, we'll find out that from a security analyst point of view, we saw there was some activity from the Tor browser. So there's some anonymization that's taken place. And then we've also detected a mass download of content. And so when we click on that, this actually fires us out into Microsoft Cloud App Security. And my page refreshed, so let me just go and grab that incident again. And Cloud App Security will tell us all about the nature of that particular compromise, and it even gives us a really nice plain English description of why MCAS thinks this is suspicious activity. So the user Alex downloaded more than 30 unique objects in a single session. 17 of them actually had a file extension of XLSX, which is a spreadsheet, and 16 of them came from the folder sales and marketing monthly reports. And in addition, we found that the IP address access came from a Tor IP address. So it starts to build a picture for you that this was a malicious activity. And then further in the activity log, it starts to tell you all about the data that might have been stolen. So in this case, there's something in here called marketing analysis. Very suspicious indeed. Now, there is a case to be made where we can stop some of this in its tracks. We don't necessarily have that configured or time to talk about that today, but you can see from an investigation point of view how powerful this is, as opposed to trying to trawl through event logs manually. Now, again, these alerts will show up in Sentinel a little bit later, but again, just showing you that if you only had the MTP components of Microsoft 365, this is how you would perform that investigation. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jay to carry on with then looking at Azure Security Center and Sentinel.
Thanks, Reese. Okay, let's switch to sharing. Okay, so hopefully we're back over in the Azure portal. Great. So now we've pivoted over. So we've done some of the investigation on the on the Microsoft Threat Protection side. So we've had a look at what we can do from that side of things. Now, in terms of the infrastructure alerts and the attacks that have happened in the infrastructure, there's a couple of things that we're going to look at. So the first one here is Security Center. So when you've got the standard version, we talked earlier a little bit about these. So we talked about policy compliance and your resource security hygiene. I think of these as more like a proactive. So these are going to be looking into, okay, am I meeting security controls? Am I following security best practices? Do I have any gaps in my security? What vulnerabilities are actually present? The threat protection is the reactive component. So this is where it's actually responding to alerts. So this is, okay, I've had a DDoS attack on my environment. Okay, there's been a SQL injection attack, or there's been some rogue processes and some of the ones that we triggered in our demos. So when we're coming in to investigate, we can come in here to Security Center directly and start to have a look at some of these alerts that have been triggered. Now, in our environment, we do have Sentinel. So Sentinel is going to stitch it all together, right? So Sentinel is going to show us the investigation experience from everything that's plugged into it. So whether it's Defender ATP, Cloud App Security, or any of your resources in the environment. But it's worth having a look here to say, okay, if we don't have Sentinel or if we're just focusing on the infrastructure, you can actually still do the investigation with Security Center. So if we drill into the threat protection, this just gives us kind of similar sort of view to what we've seen earlier, and it's just going to show us the alerts that have come in. So we've been very active. Our attack has been very, very active in our environment over the last few days, it seems, triggering all these alerts. So if we trigger based on date, we can see these alerts that have come in today. Excuse me. So if we have a look at some of these, we can see potential attempt to bypass app locker. So this is an alert that was triggered by the rogue process. So this has come up and we can see it's been run twice on the alert victim. We have a look here, we can drill into it. And again, we get this similar sort of experience. We get the plain English version of the alert that was triggered. We can see the alignment with the MITRE attack framework and which tactics have been deployed as part of this alert. And then we can drill down into the actual alert itself. So suspicious process. So reg server 32, you might remember that's the one that I was calling. And up here, we can see the exact script that I was running. So this is the command line. So if there's anything PowerShell or any attacker is running something, you can very, very easily come in here and see what's been run. Similarly, you can drill down, look at the process level, look at the host that was involved in the attack, the files that were relevant, etc., etc. So it's putting all that together for you. If we go back a couple of steps, have a look at some of these other ones. So you'll also remember there was some files that I put on there, which were some virus test files. So this has obviously been prevalent in our environment, this particular virus. So we can have a look at server victim. And we can see there, same experience. So this was my file that I had on there. This was the threat. This is the actual file, if you remember. And then the actual anti-malware agent on here has detected that and gone ahead and taken some action to prevent it. So it's actually quarantined that file for me. So since this is safe, I could go ahead and close that alert if I want, dismiss it. Okay, and then that's out of the way. So that's kind of just the view that you'll get from Security Center. And you'll get this for your PaaS services, you'll get this for your virtual machines, for anything that's bringing in those alerts into Security Center. And then once the alerts are in here, these are also going to get sent across, in our case, to Sentinel, since we're connected between Security and Center and Sentinel. These alerts will also get sent across. You can see some of the unusual attacks here as well. So these are the two that we were running on the blob storage account. So if we have a look at that, that was that file that I uploaded to blob storage. So if you're protecting your blob storage account, your actual cloud storage, you're still going to get this experience where you can look into the alerts. So this was the file that was uploaded, just a test file. It's scanned it on the upload and it's detected that it looks like a dodgy file. And then it's classified it as lateral movement in the environment. And then it's tying it into the different bits and pieces that were happening in the environment, so my IP address and so on and so forth. So that's the security center view. So we've gone through, that's kind of what you get from an infrastructure standpoint. You can pivot on these actual individual resource types and say, okay, I just want to have a look into my storage accounts and see what's happening on the storage accounts, compute, etc., etc. So whether it's containers, that will also show up here. So if you're using something like AKS, you can go ahead and enable that on your AKS clusters, and it's also going to give you similar sort of threat protection and alerting on those as well. Now, moving over to Sentinel. So this is kind of where a SOC or a security team are going to live typically. So this is your SIEM solution, security incident and event management. So from here, we will have all the capabilities and the tools you'd expect a security operations center or a SOC to have. So they're going to be doing end-to-end analysis, investigation. They're going to maybe be doing forensics. They're potentially doing threat hunting in the environment. All of the tools which they need are all in Sentinel within this portal. And as we saw before, we've hooked in the data connectors, so all of our data is streaming into this SIEM, and then we can perform the analysis from here. So from the overview page, we can go down to incidents. And again, we've been running many incidents in our environment, so we're going to see a lot of these here. And these will stay here intentionally until they're investigated. So think of it kind of like a ticket that's open. They're going to come in here until someone comes in here and actually acknowledges that they're looking into it or that they've resolved it. So if we go down to some of these as an example, we can see this was the attempt to bypass app locker. And we click on it, again, we get this view. So it's pretty consistent across the tooling where we can see the entities involved in the attack. So it was me running the attack, my account anyway. On server victim, the processes that were involved in that, they're all registered as entities, and we'll see why that's important in a second. The tactics, again, following the MITRE attack framework. And from here, we can attach it to a person. So currently this alert is unassigned. I'm going to go and assign it to Megan. Click apply. So now Megan's the owner of this incident, so she is expected to go and do some analysis. So maybe she'll move it to active, closed, etc. And she can lower the severity if she needs to. Now she wants to investigate this alert, so we'll have a look at the investigation experience on a few of these alerts. So if we start with this one, we can click investigate here, and then we get a visualization of the actual attack that's happened. So if we close some of these here. So this is the attack that happened. So potential attempt to bypass app locker. So it's giving you a good visualization so you can actually track and follow the alert. So in this case, we're looking at this one. The detected product was Azure Security Center. This could just as easily be your firewall, or it could be Defender ATP, or it could be threat intelligence feed that you've plugged into a Sentinel. Whatever it is, it will let you know where the alert's been detected from, or it could be Sentinel itself. Scroll down, we see the details of the attack again. We can go ahead and see, okay, what was the time, the process, and the command line that was run. And then from here, you can actually pivot around. So we're going to pivot on a few of these incidents, but for example, if you're doing some investigation, we might say, okay, we know that this is the attack that we're investigating, this potential attempt to bypass app locker, but we want to go ahead and see what else is happening. So as we know from the demos, a lot of sort of attacks have happened on this computer. So we can hover over it and go to related alerts, and then it's going to spin that out. So we can zoom in and out of this and shift these around and start to have a look at what all these different alerts are that's happening in the environment. So we know that this server victim has clearly been compromised, and there's a lot of attacks that have been going on here. And what we can do from this timeline is we can start to track the attack. So this attack started a couple of days ago, and we can go through and see that they've done several things over and over again. So they've come in the environment, they started running some suspicious processes, maybe that gave them some extra privileges or whatever it is they did. Then they started hiding their actions, planting their malware, so on and so forth. So if you think in terms of forensics and analysis, you're actually able to go, okay, this was the alert that I was detecting, the potential attempted app locker bypass. But in actual fact, that's not where the source of the attack started. So you can start to go through from a timeline and see how they got in and where they went. So this is useful both for internal testing. So when you have audits and things like that, you can bring up a page like this and report back to the business and say, okay, this is the point of entry. This is how they went through the environment and the attacks that they run. So you can drill down on these and get more information as you need. So you can also, I should mention, go into the raw logs as well. So if you needed to view the actual logs that are under this, you can go ahead and do that as well. Now, if we go back to the alerts page, so we want to have a look at some of these other alerts that are here. So another one that we did was we cleared the event log. So this was hiding it. So this one might, if some of these weren't here, this might not look so dodgy, and you might think, okay, that's a little bit unusual. I want to come in and have a look. So you can start your investigation there. Go, okay, we know that this was an event log. The security event log was cleared for some reason. It was cleared on server victim, which is the machine, and it was cleared by a local account called Jay. What else has Jay been up to? Let's have a look. We can hover over him again. We can, look at different pieces of the puzzle, but typically we can go to related alerts, and we can say, okay, actually Jay's been doing all kinds of stuff. So we can see then the other attacks. So it's combining them all together and trying to give you that high fidelity incident investigation experience. So you can, more easily see what's happening in your environment and pivot around to do the analysis. So that's an example of tying those few ones together that we've done on the infrastructure side. But you also want to see, okay, we know that there's been more than just that going on in the environment. So we know that there's also been some hacking tools have been run, for an example. So if we have a look here, we can see that Mimikatz has been detected in the environments, which is one of the attack tools that potentially the simulators have been running on the servers. So again, we're having a look at it. It's unassigned right now. These are the entities, and it's a credential access tactic. So we know that this is probably how they got the elevated privileges in the environment. So let's have a look into it. Okay, so we bring up the attack investigation graph again. So we look at the visualization. Again, this is the alert that we're investigating here. A bit of a description of it and some details. So this one was actually Defender ATP that detected this one. And because they're linked together through the data connectors, we're able to bring those alerts across into Sentinel. So we're bringing the alerts in from Defender or Security Center or any of the firewalls that we've got connected in, and we're sort of viewing them all together as an all-up incident analysis. So from here, this is the thing that we're worried about. So this particular attack tool which is running, so there's an executable on here which we're none too happy about. So we can pivot on it, and rather than related alerts, we can actually look at, okay, this file's been identified in other places in the environment. Okay, so we can see now the lateral movement, right? So we know that this attack occurred. It occurred on this PC here, victim. There's some other information about what happened and some related processes and files which were part of the attack. But if we pivot on the actual file that was run, we can see it was also run on the server victim. So now we know that this attacker has gone in and run these tools on multiple servers in our environment and started to move their way around and possibly get some more sensitive data. So once they did this, what did they do? Well, we know what they did, but we can go ahead and again look at the related alerts, and now we start to tie it together. So they've come in here, they've been onto the server victim, and then they've started to clear the event logs and create all these additional alerts in the system. So we're able to tie together the events that are coming from over here in Defender ATP, detected on the actual endpoint, figure out how they've laterally moved within the environment, and then what they've done once they've done that. So you can start to piece that together, again, from a timeline perspective, what's happened in the environment. Cool. So you can close that down. We're happy now. We know what was going on. So we can go back to our investigation experience, and I'm going to go ahead and close that incident. It was a true positive. It was very suspicious. Apply, and that's closed. So that's the incident and investigation experience, but we want to look a bit deeper about some of the other tools that you have in Sentinel, right? So once we've actually looked at the actual incidents, we can zoom out a bit and we can have a look at the performance of the security team itself. So we mentioned workbooks before, which are kind of like some customizable dashboards. So if we have a look at workbooks, we can go into workbooks and have a look at the ones that have been enabled. Or there's also this one here, which will allow us to click through. So if you're a IT management, or you have a team that's working on your security incidents and you want to start to look at the performance, there's a a very nice dashboard here or workbook called Security Operations Efficiency. And this one actually shows you, okay, how is my team doing? How long does it take them to triage and resolve a security incident in my environment? So you're able to actually look at the performance and the reaction time from your security team and try to actually improve your incident response capabilities. So over time, as you start to automate more and more, and as you start to be able to summarize those alerts and get rid of the noise, you expect to see some improvement in your ability to close these incidents. So 16 hours, probably not great. 3 days, 4 days for me. So I've been very slack as a security researcher in this environment. So Megan's doing a little bit better with a 10-hour response time, but you can start to see, okay, all that view of what's happening in the environment, the actions that are being taken, and start to actually manage that that team within the SOC. But they're not just for that. So you can actually look at the data from an all-up dashboard perspective as well. So we can go into the workbooks. I have a few other workbooks enabled here. This page here is the templates. So all of these are out of the box. You can go ahead and enable any of these workbooks that are relevant to you. The ones with the green are just indicating that they're already have a data connected there. So if I go to my workbooks, these are the 3 that I've got enabled here. We just saw the security operations efficiency one. You can also have just a quick look at the kind of data you can get across these other workbooks. So if we go to Azure AD, audit, and sign-in logs, view saved workbooks, again, you're going to get a graph type view with these visuals of what's happening in the environment. So maybe you can use these to start to look for anomalies, look for things that look out of place, but also to get a view all up of what's happening in the environment. So in this case, most of the logins are coming from Sydney. It seems some people have been logging in from Bankstown, Auburn, and Strathfield, but you're able to get a lot more data, a lot more rich data from the logs that are sitting under here. So all of this telemetry and logs and events which are being fed into log analytics, you're just able to leverage that data that you've got in the system to get a bit more of a rich view of what's happening in your environment. So as I said, these are all out of the box. You can go ahead and edit them if you want to, or create new widgets in here if you need to, but they're definitely available to have a look at out of the box. Security alerts is the other one that we can have a quick look at. So this one's coming across from Security Center, and it's showing us, okay, what are the alerts that have actually come into the environment? And we've got Security Center there, or we can see a lot of alerts coming from Defender ADP, Cloud App Security, etc., etc. So you're able to see where all the alerts coming from and how are they aggregated into your environment. Bit of a time graph showing the alerts. So if you're seeing some spikes in activity, then you're going to immediately see that here. And these could be the kind of dashboards that you might have on a screen if you have a SOC or something like that. Again, just different view of the different alerts that are coming through, and then a bit more detail on the actual entities here. So if you're seeing victim who's showing up a lot, you're able to see which PCs, endpoints, or users, or whatever the entity is in this particular instance, which is showing up a lot in your environment, and they'll move to the top. So victim, we've got SharePoint and Azure user. So different types of things will show up here, and they'll start to accumulate over time. Okay, one other thing I want to show you here as part of the investigation process. So we've kind of looked at it from an incident perspective. We've had a look at the dashboards and rolled up some of the data into more of a rich sort of graphical interface. You can also have a look here at this one. This is a fairly new addition to Sentinel that's worth a look. Again, it's out of the box. When you turn on Sentinel, you'll be able to get this as long as you're part of the preview experience until it rolls out to GA or to general availability. And you can actually then pivot on the accounts and the machines that are involved in some of these alerts. So pretty simply, it's going to roll up and say, okay, Alex Wilbur here has obviously been the dodgiest person in our environment, or who's been compromised the most, I should say. And victim as well, similarly, has been compromised. So if I want to say, okay, just a bit of a different way of looking at this, you can click on this and it's going to roll up the data from the entity perspective. So rather than investigating it through the incident perspective, we're pivoting on an entity. So this could be a particularly compromised account, or it could be, as Rhys was saying earlier, a privileged VIP or a privileged user or a VIP, and maybe you just want to get some more information on what that account's actually been doing. You can scroll through. It's going to give you all of the alerts that are related to that account, give you a bit of an idea of a graph of their activity. So again, this would be useful for looking into anomaly detection and that type of thing. And then on the right here, we're seeing a bit more information directly from the logs. So, user cleared the logs at this time, and these are part of the alerts that were popped. So you can scroll down and do that. Same sort of experience. If you want to have a look at victim, we can start to see the details that have come through from the victim. So these were the attacks that were run, Mimi caps, some process dumping, and all of these which were run against victim. Okay, so that's kind of the investigation experience. So we want to move over now. So we've onboarded all the environment, we've had an attack, we've investigated the attack, and it's all been fairly manual so far. So we've gone through the instant investigation process, and we've kind of had a look at what happened and how it happened, everything like that. We've done some forensics, but something like maybe the event log being cleared or the unusual process for us is something that we want to actually automate a response to that. So we're going to have a look at how can we automate a response to that. So for example, server victim, let's say in our situation, is a really sensitive computer, and if some attack is detected on that machine, we just want to go ahead and lock it down. Like it's just got too much sensitive data, and we don't want any of this data exfiltration to happen on server victim. So let's have a look at how we can actually automate that process. So when something happens, we want to completely isolate that machine. So briefly mention what these are before. So the automation capabilities within Sentinel are managed by these playbooks, and a playbook is a first-party Azure service, which is based on what's called a logic app. So logic apps are another solution in Azure, which can be used to automate different things within Azure. But in our case, we're using it from a security lens, and it's just built into the Sentinel portal here. So we can create these different logic apps to then respond to some incident. So I'll show you how that happens. So if we take a simple example like post a message to Teams. So what I usually recommend to people is to start small with your automation. So if you're fairly new, just go ahead and create a simple logic app that does something really straightforward and attach it to your alerts. So you can start to see the regularity, like how often are these alerts going to be firing, how much noise is it going to create. You can start to understand a bit more about it. And as you start to mature and as you start to see more and more patterns, go and be more targeted and more specific with your automation. So you can say, okay, look, I've got this alert, this incident that comes up all the time, and whenever the security team close that ticket, they do the same thing. So let's say they get a ticket, and all they do is they disable the user account in Azure AD, as an example. So you can go, well, if every time that incident occurs, that's what they're going to do, let's automate that process. And so what I recommend is definitely just start chipping away at your automation bit by bit, and over time, you're just clawing time back for your security or your IT operations team as you start to automate away those regular processes and things which you don't need to have people looking into directly. So if we have a look at a couple of examples here, so as I said, start simple, post a message in Teams. So if we click into this logic app, now it looks a bit daunting, but you don't have to worry about most of this stuff. You can start, as I said, start simple. We can either click edit or click logic app designer, and we get a GUI, which is great. So we get this logical workflow here. So logic app effectively is a logical workflow. It starts with a trigger. So any logic app is going to have a trigger which actually spins up the logic app. So it's a serverless technology. We say, okay, when this trigger occurs, then go ahead and run this logic app. So in our case, the trigger is going to be an alert in Sentinel. So we're saying when this alert gets fired in Sentinel, run this logic app. What this logic app does is that then the second step is it's going to pull in some data from the alert. So it's going to pull in the subscription ID, resource ID, so on and so forth. And then the next thing it's going to do is just post a message. So these are just dynamic, these are variables. So you're able to go ahead and bring in those, the data from the alert. So whether it's the title, the severity, et cetera, this is all customizable. And this message will pop up in the Contoso IT team in the security operations channel. So that's pretty straightforward. You can also set it to do maybe open a ticket in ServiceNow. So if we go to new step, we can go ahead. These are all, again, pre-wired APIs. You can create custom connectors, but they're pre-wired. So if we wanted to look into ServiceNow, we can just do a search on here and find out, in this case Adobe, we can just do a search and find whatever is the connector that we want to do. So there's connectors in here for ServiceNow, Jira, a lot of the big ticketing, and you may want to open a ticket every time this alert gets raised. So you can certainly do that here. So it also, if you're using non-Microsoft technologies, Slack and whatever it is, it's not just a Microsoft tool is the point. So you can go ahead and integrate this with your third-party applications as well. Another thing that you might want to do is run a script. So you can pretty much, get very creative with the logic app. So you may want to run a script or a PowerShell command or some ARM template, etc., etc. But you can get very creative and very complex once you start to get familiar with the logic apps. And there are a lot of possibilities in the way that you can automate these. So I'll just show you one more logic app. So what we're going to, and we'll actually have a look at what this one's going to do, and we'll see this one in action. So this logic app you can see is running. So this logic app was actually triggered when we did some of those alerts. So I'll show you what this looks like. So we've actually assigned this logic app already to the alert rule. So when that alert gets fired, this logic app started running. So if we have a look at this logic app, this one's quite a bit more detailed than the previous one. So if we go to edit the logic app, we've got a lot more steps here. So we won't go through too much detail, but the good news is I actually pulled this out of a GitHub repo. So this logic app is all part of this GitHub Sentinel community, which we've got some links to these resources as well. And this is the product group adds here a lot of things. So when customers request new workbooks, playbooks, hunting queries, alert, detection rules, etc., they're all added into this GitHub repository. If I go to playbooks, and you'll see down here, there's isolate Azure VM to NSG. So all I've done is I've found this one in the repository. We've got the JSON code here along with the README, and I can click deploy to Azure, and that will create the logic app for me. All you need to do then is just give it some credentials and put in a few of the variables that it requests, and you're good to go. So if we go back to our logic app, so as I said, this logic app is a little bit more complex than the previous one, so it's got a few more steps there. So if we go to alert incident, it's again pulling in the alerts, getting some data from the alert, so getting the host entities. We initialize a few variables, put in a HTTP request, so you can drill into this in more detail. As I said, it's all in that GitHub repo. But a couple of things that I like to highlight, it runs through a for each loop for each of the alerts that it's looking into. And then it pulls out the hosts in the alerts, and then it pulls them into these additional variables. Now, once it's got all the data and the information that it needs to do, it will send this thing called an approval email. Now, the approval emails are pretty cool. What it does is it sends an email to the email contact, which is one of the variables that you configure, and that will actually give the user a button, an opportunity to then respond to the alert. And I'll show you what that looks like. So this approval email goes out to the user that you configure. Now you can think this could be out of hours, this could be weekend, or it could be, you have a small team. So this goes to a non-technical person, a risk manager or IT manager. They can actually perform technical response and mitigate alerts without having to have permissions or access to the system. So we're just following a workflow, and the logic app has all the rights and the permissions, and it just requires the user to actually action that. So once that happens, we can go ahead and pass in a lot of this data here. As I said, you can have a look at that later on if you like to. So what we get down to is we get this condition. So when I show you the email, you see there's a yes and a no, or a true and a false box. And we're saying, if yes, go and perform a set of actions. If no, go and perform a different set of actions. So we've just got a true false fork here in this conditional rule inside the logic app. So then typically what you'll do is update the incident once you've actually responded to it, and perhaps you'll close the incident as well. So you can automate the end-to-end process and incident investigation process, from opening the ticket, analyzing, responding to the alert, mitigating the issue, and then closing or updating the ticket within the system as well. So we've got this logic app running, right? So this logic app is attached to one of our analytics rules. So if we go down into our analytics rules and have a look at our security event log cleared, So we kind of breezed over this before, but if we go to automated response, you can see I have attached the isolate Azure VM to NSG. So what happens when this alert gets triggered is this logic app will fire, and it's going to actually go and isolate our VM, as I said before. We just want to go ahead. This is too sensitive. We don't want anything happening there, so we're going to go ahead and isolate it automatically. So this logic app gets fired, but I do have an approval gate in there because, you know, maybe it's a false positive, or I just don't want to shut down the virtual machine for no reason. So we've sent the approval email to Megan. So this is Megan's account here. So Megan has received the approval request, and this is what it looks like. So we've got the message body here. Again, you can configure that how you like. And Megan receives the email saying this case ID, this is the event and the alert severity on this subscription. Do you want to isolate the VM? It's pretty straightforward there. They're not messing around. Isolate VM, approve or reject. So if I reject it, then I'm assuming it's a false positive and I want to leave the VM up and running. I'm like, actually, no, this looks a bit dodgy, approve. So you could be isolating a VM, you could be disabling a user account, running a script, whatever it is that you want to go ahead and do. But once you hit approve, then you're actually gonna implement those actions. So in this case, we've approved it. We're saying yes. Got a nice thank you message there. So now we're going to go and have a look at our virtual machine and just see what's happened there. So if we go back to the logic app to start with, so we can see in the playbooks. Yep. So that's just running here, and then that's finished running. So that'll complete the process there. So once we complete that, we can go and have a look, and we can say, okay, we've got our virtual machines. As I said, best to do the search there. Go to the virtual machines. Now, server victim was the one here that we've isolated. So I've actually been kicked off it. I was RDP'd to that machine earlier, but I've been kicked off because that's now been isolated. Look into the virtual machine, go to networking, and we can see here that there's a new network security group. So this is an NSG, or a network security group. So effectively what an NSG is, if you're not familiar, is it has ACLs, so access control lists, for allow deny. So this is the network security group that's just been dynamically attached to my virtual machine by the logic app. And you can see the first rule here, port any inbound, deny. So effectively they've taken whatever NSG I had assigned to this virtual machine and removed it. So it's not been deleted, it's just been removed or detached from this virtual machine. And the logic app has now attached this NSG. And so denial is blocked. So this server's locked down now, no one can get to it. So I can go ahead and modify that if I wanted to. I can go and put a different network security group. You can see if I go in here, I'll see the other one that was there, and I can just change that back to the one so as we can access it again. But effectively, that's what's happened. So it's given it a random GUID and then gone ahead and locked it down. So that was the original one, and then we're back. So that's pretty much it. So just to summarize that, we've gone through the investigation process, starting on the infrastructure only side in Security Center. Then we've gone into Azure Sentinel, kind of zoomed out and looked at an all overview of our entire IT estate. So whether you've got that coming from Defender ATP, Windows endpoints, or whatever it's coming from, you can do the end-to-end analysis there. And then following that, once that's happened, we've responded to it and started to build in some automation into that process. So now, anything you want to add there, or bring up the slides again, Reese?
Yeah, I think we should wrap up now.
Sounds good. So let me bring back, I did say the slides were over. We've just got a few wrap-up slides, and we'll be around if there's any more questions, and please do pop them in. So just to wrap up, we've got next steps. We've got a lovely QR code here, and the URL that you can visit to access all of this. So if you like to access the recording and the slides, please go ahead and go to the URL here. You'll have access to all the content that we used and the resources. Please give us some feedback. We'd love to hear if it was useful. As I said at the beginning, we can't cover everything in one session, but we tried to dive straight in and just get stuck into some of the nuts and bolts of the technology. If there's something else you'd like to see or something else that's relevant, let us know. We'd love to set up something that would help you guys out more. There are free trials, so MTP, Sentinel, Security Center, these all have some varying levels of trials available. So if you're in Azure today and you want to have a look at Sentinel Security Center, enable the standard version and you get 30 days free, and then you can go ahead and disable that later. Similarly, there's free trials available for threat protection. If you're looking at implementing these, let us know. We can work together. There's some programs available at Microsoft to get partner workshops and different things kicked off to try and help you get started with these technologies in your own environment. And then, sure, everyone's taking it.
Just to close on that, if you go and follow that QR code, it's only a 1-question feedback survey, just a rating out of 5. Would appreciate that. And also, you can pop your email address in there if you'd like to be contacted on the back of this discussion if you'd want to have a one-on-one session. And also in that form is then the link to the slides and the recording. Now, best to keep a hand on that link to the slides and check back later in the day, because we need to obviously cut the recording and upload it. So it should be up early afternoon. It'll be a link in one of the slides. So after this slide here, there's a resources slide, and there'll be a link to the recording. So just check back later in the day, but please give us some feedback. That would be greatly appreciated. And so there's the resources there. There'll be a slide later. There'll be a link later on once we upload the recording. Personal thank you for me. Appreciate it was a very long session, but I hope you appreciate the content and the depth of what we went into here. Didn't want to bore you with death by PowerPoint. Hope you appreciated the live interaction. So that's a thanks from me.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate your time. We know that time is very valuable, so we appreciate you making the effort to come along today. And yep, let us know if there's anything else we can help you with. Enjoy the rest of your Friday and your weekend.